In this session, we're going to have a look at an aspect of assessment which is important for a number of reasons, but mainly to show that assessment hasn't always been designed as well as we might like to think it has. So if we go back a number of years to Roman times, so we're looking at Western assessment here. A lot of the Chinese education systems much older, but it wasn't until about the 1800s that they began to have a full curriculum, particularly around the sciences, and we'll focus mainly on the Western form of education and assessment for this particular topic. So when we look at going back to the Roman times, you would say that Roman soldiers, arguably some of the finest soldiers in history, and partly because of the assessment structure that's built in the profession of soldiering. Now, we don't usually think of skills-based work such as Army or Navy as being requiring assessment, but it certainly does. So initially, the Roman soldiers were chosen as those who had the appropriate characteristics to be soldiers. So those that were smart, those that had the appropriate physical attributes, and of course social background, which plays a big part in early assessment across the world and education. Those people who had skills in horse riding naturally may have progressed to the cavalry as a result of this diagnostic assessment. And if you recall, diagnostic assessment is designed up front to basically try and find a little bit more out about the students that you have before you start teaching them. So make sure that you can focus the teaching and the learning process properly. So formative training in the army, back in the Roman times, you're looking at marching, swimming, weapon handling. All of these things here basically are designed to improve the skills of the soldiers. And once they were competent with their weapon work against inanimate objects, so their technique was right, their strength was good, then they were permitted to advance to training against other people. So it basically ensured that not only the students, the army trainees, and their trainers understood what the capabilities of themselves was. It also was a very authentic assessment regime. So by authentic assessment, we're talking about those that actually relate to the real world in which you're going to have to put these skills into play. So there's no point in developing a skill about using swords or riding horses if you don't actually have horses or swords to practice with. In summative assessment, which is the other form of assessment, and the one we typically see in most of our assessment tasks, it counts for marks. So formative assessment, most of the assessment that you will encounter at university is essentially got a formative aspect to it. It's designed to help you learn. The summative assessments that you do are the ones that count for marks and the ones that you tend to focus a lot of your effort on them. If you think about it in an army context, summative assessment ends up being in a battle situation, very severe examination, and the consequences of not passing, very, very bad. Let's have a look at education back in ancient times. So basically this is worldwide, it doesn't matter where you were from, children from rich families were given the chance to receive a strong education. Military service taught practical skills, and also apprenticeships were very important then as well. And they ran in families or family type units. When we get to medieval times, so around about 1000 AD or 800 AD, military service was still teaching practical skills. Apprenticeships now had changed. They were contracted and related to guilds or groups of people who had the skills in that field. And of course, children from rich families were given the chance to receive a strong education. Nothing much has changed there. But also the first universities in Europe started to be created. So that's around about 1000 AD. For people in trades, people with skills, blacksmiths, candle making, carpenters, cobblers, all of those sorts of people, they underwent similar sort of assessment processes to the military. So diagnostically, people were evaluated to see whether they had the skills that might allow them to grow to become good craftsmen or good apprentices. And then they were monitored by members of the guild. And that was basically an ongoing summative assessment. So if your work was not up to scratch, the guild had the right to basically kick you out of that field and and ensure that you didn't actually practice with any authoritative credibility. So you weren't a guild member, you basically were not considered to be a very good craftsman. So as an example, Benjamin Franklin, very famous man in America, famous scientist involved in lots of very key parts of American history. He was actually expected to become a blacksmith, and a diagnostic assessment basically showed that he was not really up to being a blacksmith, but his love of books allowed him to basically get apprenticed to a printer, in which case he became much more learned, and in terms of his contribution to society, much bigger because of that diagnostic assessment than it was if he'd become a blacksmith. Let's have a look at universities. So universities, if we're talking about the 11th to the 15th centuries, they typically relied on oral assessment. In that case, lots of memorization was required there. They understood the texts, basically the books, the manuscripts that were around, and they would memorize large chunks of that. So they had immense capability of remembering materials, much greater than we probably have today. And they were very, very clever at using that information to try and make an academic argument. So essentially, assessment relied on your ability to communicate what you knew and what you understood about what you knew. No different from what we do today, except, of course, it wasn't written, it was oral. The concerns that people had around this particular method was that the depth of learning outcomes is potentially limited. The fact that you're using so much of your brain to memorize materials basically means it's not available for other aspects of it. But nonetheless, extremely sophisticated and amazing memory systems that they had there. And indeed, if we look at Powerkey, he commended the thoroughness of the disputation system, and particularly the mental capacity of the lecturers and students, who basically had to memorize everything. In order to be prepared for these oral disputations, there was an opportunity for formative assessment where students basically practiced their work amongst peers, and often quite brutal. So if you didn't get things right, you were humiliated, bullied, or kicked out of the university. And indeed, it was quite brutal, particularly because of the class system that was there. Richer students certainly outnumbering poorer students significantly, and certainly getting the greater opportunity to develop themselves. So when do we get exams? So final examinations in medieval universities, around about 1000 to 1500 AD, typically revolving around the disputation. When students were ready to sit in the examination, they were provided with questions they could be asked on a topic of which they would argue, and then there was a big public event where the examination was held. Essentially, the pressure was possibly less on students in that time, because they basically only could sit the disputation when their masters, when their teachers had basically said that the student was ready. So very few failed. And of course, some of them didn't fail because of corruption and other things. So why were things done this way? What made people think that this was the best way to do it? Well, the rationale behind it essentially was that it was the only way to do it. If you recall the time period that we're looking at here, there were no pens of any merit, and certainly the books that were available to people, the students, were handwritten and hand-scribed. So, why were things done this way? Basically, it's because there was no printing press. And the printing press was developed a little bit earlier in China than it was in the rest of the world, but it eventually popped up. And in the first 40 years, the printing press existing, there are about 20 million books published, over 20,000 titles. And certainly in 2003, there was somewhere between 75 and 175 million titles in existence. There is no doubt that the printing press made significant changes to the way that education worked, and it certainly had its impact on assessment. So let's have a quick look at that. So, printing press comes out, big ranging outcomes from that. Other technologies which started to pop up around that time and onwards, classrooms. Classrooms at some stage were basically not in existence. They became a thing as the number of students increased. There was an idea, we'll put them in classrooms, slates, which are basically like little blackboards that people could write on. And that basically gave an individualized approach to the learning process. Quills, fountain pens, the precursors to modern biros, modern pens. Blackboards, at one point in time, were also considered to be an innovation. And certainly some people got carried away with these things. Some classes in America basically painted all their walls as blackboards so that they could write all over them. Horn books, basically a piece of paper. Paper was very, very expensive at the time and coated with a thin layer of horn to protect the paper. And you can see an example of that in the image there. All of these things here helped with formative assessment, as you can imagine. So the idea of actually being able to see the alphabet and be able to read it out, very powerful tool for formative assessment. So certainly the printing press changed the world as it stands today, but there are other things in practice as well. So it used to be that medieval universities ranked their students in final examinations, and it was usually because of the way that they lived in society. So if you were rich and had a famous father, there was a good chance that you were going to be ranked first in the final examinations. And certainly they were very brutal in terms of not necessarily rewarding people who lost disputes. And certainly some people might be called the jackass or get a wooden spoon if they basically failed to get top honours. In the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, it changed a little bit. So instead of ranking people, it basically turned into providing marks to students. And basically this convention has been retained at most educational institutions since that time. So what we're saying here is that providing marks to students was one way of addressing the poor format that was existing before. The whole idea of ranking based on status in society went away. It was then based upon merit, but eventually it got turned into marks so that this ranking system could basically have some sort of justification. All the time this is going on, early 19th and early 20th centuries, education was increasing significantly. So we're looking at massive changes in enrolment over that period of time. And what we see here is basically that because of the change in numbers of enrolments, the way that assessment had to be practiced changed as well. So written exams were one of those things. So the medieval style of learning and assessment continued at universities for hundreds of years. It was not until the 18th century that written examinations were introduced. And the main reason for that was not because someone thought that it was pedagogically sound, it was because they thought that they couldn't do it anymore. So we had an argument in class about the logistics of marking 500 students using such essay or short answer questions. It's just very, very difficult. And this is the same sort of problem that universities were encountering around the 18th century. So the idea of creating new examination types was necessary for a pragmatic reason, not necessarily because of a pedagogical one. So by the mid-19th century, they're basically everywhere, from elementary school to university. And back in the end of the 19th century, there was actually a backlash against the whole assessment modes that were happening there. So the late 19th century, what we were seeing here was everything was being examined, everything was being marked, everything was trying to get a bit of a number, and eventually people realised that maybe this was not the best way of going. So essentially the examinations or the assessment methods changed from disputations to written exams. And this is quite an interesting quote from Woodrow Wilson, famous man in America, president. The examination took place on Saturday last, and a very fair, sensible examination it was. Adams gave out 5 topics and told us to choose, each man for himself, one from the number, and spend 2 hours in writing an informal essay upon it. That's the sort of examination I like. But it wasn't the sort I had expected, and I went in crammed with 100 or 200 dates and 1 or 2,000 minute particulars about the quarrels of nobody knows who with an obscure governor for nobody knows what. Just think of all that energy wasted. The only comfort is that this massive information won't long burden me. I shall forget it with great ease. The point Woodrow Wilson's making here is that to pass some of the exams and back in 1884, and certainly it's continued in lots and lots of places, is that the whole idea of passing exams basically involves cramming lots and lots of information in your brain, and eventually, once it serves its purpose, it leaves your brain. And what Wilson was thinking of was, well, okay, well, this is good. We can write an essay about particular issues and show some of the understanding that we've gained from all that knowledge. So, by the beginning of the 20th century, concerns about the essay grew rapidly. Part of this was because the world began to believe that you could scientifically measure anything, including intelligence and education. And so the subjective nature of the essay caused problems with this sort of mindset. Thorndike, psychologist, early educational researcher, was really a key mover in this area, and certainly his influence was significant in terms of developing new forms of assessment that essentially would allow you to put numbers to things much easier than written assessments would. So Thorndike influenced the first development of the first multiple choice question, MCQ, and it was used as part of a reading test administered to children. The key about this one was that the ability to mark this new test item quickly and without ambiguity was really powerful. And it certainly got put to scale, it got put into practice on a very large scale. One of the earliest things, an intelligence test based on the work of Binet and Simon in France, and part of work in the US, consisting of multiple choice questions, was used on over 1 million servicemen in the US during World War I. The successful development, use and analysis of this tool influenced everything. The fact that they felt that they could measure intelligence of all these servicemen really, really easily was very, very powerful. And it started to influence universities and entrance examinations to colleges. The SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, is what it stands for, and it was devised for the College Board to implement it at the most highly regarded universities in the world, in the United States, but also worldwide. This only became a thing because they lost so many people during World War II. So a lot of the men went off to war. It actually became really difficult to continue to have essay-based entrance examinations marked, whereas the SAT could be marked really easily with very limited resources. And soon machine reading of examination papers was something that occurred after their introduction, and that meant that even when people came back from World War II, they still stuck with what was a much more efficient system, if not necessarily a more accurate one. So, what we're seeing here is that there's been changes in the way that we assess people, but it's not necessarily been based on good pedagogy. It's been based on some ideas, but mainly it's been based around efficiency. So we go from the oral disputation to written examinations because it was more efficient to do it that way. We change to multiple choice questions because it becomes much more efficient to do it. And circumstances in the world, greater numbers going to universities, train people to actually do the marking for these things, essentially meant that assessment methods changed for pragmatic reasons rather than any other reason. We're looking at assessment and evaluation. All that's about assessment. Evaluation here would be what you saw overall there was an evaluation of assessment. So we talked all about assessment all the way through, but it was an historic evaluation overall. So assessment's not always introduced or used for pedagogically sound reasons, and we just have to accept that sometimes if we can't change it. There's lots of innovation occurring in assessment, but more is needed to better measure learning outcomes, and cost effectiveness will be a requirement. For week 2, there's some things that we'll be looking at. There's some readings up there for you already. We'll be looking at Bloom's taxonomy. We'll be looking at the Solo taxonomy. We'll be looking at constructive alignment and the basics of assessment design. Okay, I hope this has given you a bit of a feel for the nature of assessment and how it's changed, and the fact that we're actually now looking at assessment from a much more appropriate viewpoint than has been done a lot of the time in history. So we can choose assessments which actually meet the needs of the learning that we want to achieve for the students. That's it. I will post another summary of other aspects of the session today, and also a quick summary of the assessment tasks. Thank you.